Hi friends. So today we are going to talk about how good clinical practices is actually a part of patient engagement and how both of these are critical activities in clinical research. So thank you so much for joining us. Give me a second to share the presentation. So we're going to talk about patient engagement in clinical research and the importance of good clinical practices. Now, all of us understand that India is now world's most populous and leading economy. The need of medical research and the innovative treatment for our people is not just appealing idea, it's a good idea. No, it's an essential idea. We are a big population, we are a big economy, we need to support our own healthcare. We need high quality healthcare and we need it through evidence based medicine. So we've always heard that India is the pharmacy of the world. So not only is India the pharmacy of the world, now India is actually a pharmacy to itself. And I think it's very, very critical that it perform this role well, not only because of the fact that, it should, it can. And this was demonstrated very well during the COVID time. You've seen the COVID vaccine that was developed and how the development process actually happened. But during this time, even during the COVID, you must have heard several, background noise saying, that these studies are being done very fast. There's a new vaccine. It's an Indian vaccine. Do Indian vaccines have quality? All those little concerns from patients and participants. So it's very important that, we share with patients what research is and how useful it is and how there are processes in place, including good clinical practices that protect them and thus help patients engage proactively in research. Now, just to recap for those of us who are new to the idea of clinical research, that good clinical practices is a basic minimal guideline of research and research around the world. So there's two types of good clinical practices for our relevance. One is the international good clinical practices, which is the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use, called ICH. So it's called the ICH Good Clinical Practice or ICH GCP. And then there's the Indian Good Clinical Practice or the Indian GCP, which is mandated through the Indian drug regulator. Now, both these GCPs are almost synchronous. There's very little disparity, and those finer points that are there are only for technical reasons. So I'm sure people who are professionally looking at clinical research as a career will go back and compare these two documents. We also have a small presentation later, and you can go to that, and that actually compares and contrasts both these documents. But for practical purposes, good clinical practice is a set of guidelines for biomedical studies, which encompasses the design, conduct, termination, audit, analysis, reporting, documentation of study involving human subjects. This is the technical definition. But if you have to remember only one thing, the one thing that you must remember, this is a guideline that is for ensuring well-being of study subject. Its basic tenet is that whenever a study is done on human being, research on human being, the interest neither of science nor of society will take precedence over the individual patient who has participated in the research. Now, these good clinical practices establish two guidelines, two principles. One principle is protection of the human research subject, and the second is authenticity of biomedical data. Now, I strongly believe that the second principle also is a part of the first principle in itself, because if there is authentic data, there is protection of the patient and his rights. Going a little more into detail, again, to recap that the basic three principles of GCP, which come from the previous pre-existing Belmont report and what other, are justice, respect, beneficence, and non-maleficence. Again, you will realize that these are all patient and participant centric. So all public centric, patient centric, participant centric principles. Now there are 13 principles of GCP. If you get down to it, there are if you will read the good clinical practices documents, these principles are listed and how practically they are ensured during participation of a patient in a clinical trial, those are mentioned. So first principle is the principle of essentiality. That means if it is not essential, do not do the trial. Now, these are principles that are upheld not only by the investigator, but also by the ethics committee, which is the local regulatory body, and the national regulatory bodies. So today we're going to talk only about the first two principles. That's the principles of essentiality, presence principle of voluntariness, informed consent, and community agreement. Now, these are the things that I believe are very critical to the current story of participation of patients in clinical research and how patients should become more aware. So the rest I'm going to leave. So those who are of us who are part of clinical research always hear this as conferences and continuously at trainings and meetings that research is patient centric. But is it really patient centric? Is the communication that goes out is not really about patient centricity. Sadly, the communication that goes out is this, talking about how patients are human guinea pigs, whether they're guinea pigs for the greedy Indian farm of greedy pharmaceutical companies, etc. So why this communication happens is because while we have read and we know that there are so many principles, so many processes that will protect the patient, but the patient still feels that he's a guinea pig. Why is that happening? Because there is a communication gap. When the patient speaks, we don't listen. When we speak, the patient doesn't understand. So let's talk about the patient's voice in research, why it should be heard, how can it be heard, and where does the Indian patient stand in this, and how does GCP or good clinical practices fit in the story. So what is the patient's voice in research? Patient can participate as a true research partner. All of us who are in research understand that there can be no research without a clinical research without a patient, right? So the new terms for you are patient-oriented evidence that matters, or POEM, and patient-reported outcomes, qualitative research, and dissemination of research. So if you want your patient to truly be a research partner, the participation in real-world evidence especially should include parameters or evidence that interest the patient. Now, there are situations, and I'm sure many of us would have faced them, especially in cancer studies or studies with children or studies with pregnant women, in which the patient's concerns are very different from those that are listed in research as a research outcomes. So now, with real world evidence gaining Ghana, it's important that patient oriented evidence that matters become a part of this repertoire, including patient reported outcomes. Now, while I was a beginner, novice researcher, patient reported outcomes have always been a part. So there used to be this patient diary that the patient was supposed to fill. But many a times, this was a secondary or a tertiary or an exploratory indicator. And many of times, if it was not filled, no big deal. But today's world, this has become very, very critical, because real world evidence is relying a lot on patient reported outcomes, and this has now, we will see in later slides how new guidances have come up from the US FDA and how this has become part of publication policy, that this is being emphasized continuously both in academic research and in clinical trials. Qualitative research is of immense importance, especially for patient advocacy groups and patient concerns, because this is talking about things that may actually make a real difference to them. So again, these are terms that we should look at and as researchers learn them. Uh, Dissemination of research and sharing of results is an important thing. And what happens is we use a lot of technical jargon to publish our research, because we publish in journals. It's over time, if you would have seen during COVID, now I'm seeing more and more articles coming in the newspaper, more and more articles coming in the news itself being discussed. So dissemination is getting on a little bit more in layperson language or in simple manners of communication. Even publication groups have now started saying that simple language summaries are important, but it has not reached that tipping point yet where it is a mandate that there will be lay language or simple language summaries. Why should the voice be heard? Because we've spoken about how reality of real life is really missing. If you look at randomized control trials, this is an interesting WHO document that I just saw recently. This is talking about health effects of non-sugar sweeteners, which is, we all use aspartame and other sucralose, etc. It's in randomized control trials, you'll see that this non-sugar sweeteners were seen to decrease body weight, decrease BMI, decrease, or not really impact type 2 diabetes, not really impact all-cause mortality, no data on cancers, but decreased daily energy intake, decreased daily calorie intake. But real-world evidence actually showed that it increased adiposity almost 2%, twice. So that means it actually increased the weight. It increased body mass index. It increased type 2 diabetes, and it was being sold as treatment or support for patients who are diabetic, right? But it seemed to have increased diabetes. It increases mortality rate. It increased cardiovascular mortality. It even impacted bladder cancers. So, an increased preterm birth. So, real world evidence is very different, and real world evidence cannot happen without patients. Although clinical trials also cannot happen without patients, but there can be a lot of data there. So listening to patient voice is very important. There is not only a social reason for it, an ethical reason for it, but there is now a very practical reason for it. Because in real world evidence and real world data, there is need of diversity, there is need for inclusiveness, there is need for more data. And that can happen only if the patient is participating in research. Now, how can it be done? This is a very simple overview of it. The first process is to actually train them in human subjects training. So then explain to them research ethics, regulatory processes and methods in lay language or simple language. And let me tell you, it's possible. It's being done not only globally, but even now being done in India, as we will see in the presentation later. There is provide them opportunities to participate in focus groups on discussion of protocols, panels. Again, this is something that has been done and that is being done in India now. So it is something that the conversation has to start, and the conversation has to be in simple language. I think that is a very, very critical part of the uh, participation of patient. There must be trust, there must be integrity, there must be respect. Finally, at the higher end, the aspiration is that there will be a complete partnership, that the research team will include clinicians, researchers, as well as patients and patient advocates. They will be part of research advisory committees and stakeholder panels. uh, I'm going to skip this. So around the world, changes have started happening, as we spoke about. Look at the US FDA draft on core patient reported outcomes in cancer clinical trials. This is a guidance document for industry. There is a publication support document from the Equator Network, which is talking about inclusion of patient reported outcomes in clinical trial protocols. Research has been done, and I'm sharing with you a work that was done by our group in 2014, which is talking about patient awareness of research. And at the same time, similar report was actually there from Navi Mumbai as well. But times have changed. In 2022, BNB conducted the similar research questionnaire talking about what's the awareness of research. Awareness of research has drastically improved. So, is it because of COVID? Is it because of access? Is it because of the fact that Indian and pharma has come up so much, and there is so much conversation on the news? There is so much focus on it. Whatever the reason, excuse me, the change has happened, and it's time for us to participate in the change. So this is a program that we started in February 2023, talking about patient advocates, excuse me, engagement in research, and Mr. Shirol here has been very, very critical in actually advocating for the rare disease policy, and the rare disease policy has also been launched this year. 2023 has been an interesting year for clinical research and patient awareness of research in India. So the first workshop actually was conducted at Medanta, and 50 patient advocates participated in it. They were really exciting questions. And attempt was made to use simple language communication in clinical research and talk about basics of clinical research and consent. The second workshop was conducted in Amrita in Faridabad, and it spoke about again understanding of clinical research and the laws of the land, which is talking about GCP, talking about bioethics, the ICMR guidelines, and the NDCT 2019. So this also was attended by 60 plus participants. In case you want to know a little bit more about good clinical practices, you can look at this program that Apar Health is running. You can look at the website. In case you need some more guidance, you can either ask Myra or myself. You can go to our website and under the courses, look for Indian Good Clinical Practices. Story is changing, and it's a good idea for all of us as researchers to become more responsible and more participating in this new story. So thank you so much for joining us today.